Welcome to the Anime Audiophile Podcast. Please like and subscribe for more. Thank you. Kakashi Retsuden, the Sixth Hokage and the Failed Prince. Chapter 2. A letter arrived from the palace for Nanera. The anniversary of the previous king's death was upon them, and Nanera was to come to the capital. "I'm not going," Nanera announced and shut himself in his room. There wasn't a lock on the door though, so Kakashi could have opened it if he wanted to. Instead, he knocked and said, "How about you come out and we go pick your horse? You need to leave tomorrow if you're going to make it in time." "I don't want to go to the capital." It was just a brief trip back to the palace where he'd been born and raised, so he should have been happy, and yet, for some reason, Nanera was stubbornly against it. Kakashi looked at Margot. "Is it always like this?" "Couldn't say." Margot shook her head. "This is the first time a message has ever come from the palace." Kakashi knocked on the wooden door again. "An order from the palace is official. You might be a prince, but you can't ignore it." A mumbled reply came finally from the other side of the door. "What'll happen if I do?" "There'll be punishment." For Margot. Margot was his official guardian. If Nanera didn't go to the palace, he would be in defiance of the queen, and Margot would be the first to get the whip. Nanera waited a bit and then opened the door ever so slightly. Peeking a timid face out, he looked at Kakashi and Margot in turn as he muttered, "I'll go to the palace." Margot's relief was fleeting. "But," Nanera added, pushing his head out further through the crack in the door. "You come too, Kakashi." "Then I'll go." Farm work needed to get done that wouldn't if 3 horses were taken from the village, so Margot ended up staying in Nagar. It was a 3 days ride from Nagar to the capital, including changing horses along the way. Kakashi and Nanera rode alongside each other and stopped at a town along the way before night fell. Nanera didn't reveal his royal status, but even so, the townspeople welcomed them and offered them a meal and comfortable lodgings for the night. Naturally, this wasn't free. Nanera paid for this hospitality with the jewels that Margot had made Nanera bring along. There were no inns or anything like, so Nanera and Kakashi slept separately at whatever houses had an extra futon. That night, Nanera tossed and turned in his bed. He couldn't get to sleep. He should have been exhausted from being on horseback since morning, but he couldn't sleep. He felt gloomy and sad, a heavy rock in the pit of his stomach, thinking they would be at the capital in 2 more days. He finally gave up on sleep and got up. It was the middle of the night, but fortunately, a full moon hung in the sky, and it was light enough to see even without a lantern. He was wandering about when he noticed the light of a butter lamp swinging beneath the wisteria trellis in the plaza. Kakashi. He was sitting on a rock in place of a chair, the spine of a book set on propped-up knee, reading. Wisteria blossoms spilling from the vines fluttered in the breeze, alternately hiding and revealing him. Kakashi noticed Nanera and slapped the book closed, casually covering the front of it with his long fingers. "What's the matter?" "Nothing. I couldn't sleep, so I was just taking a walk," Nanera muttered sulkily and turned around, but he stopped when Kakashi called out to him. "If you can't sleep, why don't you read for a while? One of those stories about that 6th Hokage you love. If I read something like that, I'll be even more awake." "So then practice your characters," Kakashi said, walking over to him. "I would probably fall asleep pretty quick," he admitted. The scent of wisteria flowers that trailed after Kakashi was cold and sweet like frozen honey, and mixed with the light of the moon, it dizzied him somehow. Nanera awkwardly let out the breath he'd been holding. He knew the reason why he couldn't sleep. "Kakashi, I don't want to go to the capital." "Is it because there's someone you'd rather not see?" Nanera kicked the ground and nodded reluctantly. He was honestly annoyed that Kakashi hit the mark so easily, but for now, his desire to talk to someone outweighed his irritation. "Is there someone there you're scared of?" Kakashi asked gently. Nanera frowned and said nothing. "The Prime Minister?" "I don't want to see him either, but it's mostly my sister," he said and clamped his mouth shut. Kakashi waited for a bit to give Nanera the space to continue, but he stayed quiet. He stayed where he was though, right by Kakashi's side. I've wondered about this for a while, Kakashi started slowly. Why did your sister inherit the throne and not you? According to the customs of this land, the first in the line of succession is the eldest son. Nanera stared at the ground. 'Cause my sister's way smarter than me. Is that all? He looked up at the butter lamp in Kakashi's hand. The chilled, strained night air softened a little around the lamp, rocked by the flame. I didn't want to do it. He clenched his small hands into fists. The Prime Minister asked me if I would succeed the throne, and I said that I wasn't going to, so my sister should. Why? Kakashi asked. Why? Nanera repeated. Because it'd be boring. I hate studying. There's no way I want to be stuck at a desk working from morning till night. Like my father, he added in his head. He should have had so many fun memories, but the only look on his father's face he could remember now was a frown. Apart from when he would sometimes play with Nanera, he was always holed up in his office. Anyway, the Prime Minister said he'd respect my wishes. So my sister ended up inheriting the throne. Was that something she wanted? Kakashi said. I don't know. He shrugged. But she said she would do it. And then the Prime Minister suggested I move out here, so I ended up living in the village, far away from all the politics stuff. Do you regret that choice? Nanera shook his head lifelessly. Living in Nagar is super fun. But maybe I shouldn't have done that to my sister. He had known that his kind sister would take the throne in his place. That was exactly why he felt all right about walking away from his right to inherit. He'd been certain that his sister would never be as irresponsible as he was. And everything had gone just as he'd expected. Manari accepted the throne and Nanera obtained his freedom. I pushed everything onto her. I took advantage of her kindness. So that's why you're afraid to go to the capital. Nanera hesitated for a second and then nodded. I'm scared to see her. It'd be okay if she was having fun being queen. But if she's not? If she wants to quit being ruler? Kakashi casually spoke the words that Nanera had avoided and looked him straight in the eye. Would you take her place and become king? He didn't want to. But he also didn't want to cause his sister pain. Nanera pursed his lips and dropped his eyes. Kakashi's shadow fell onto the dry earth, stretching out in a strange shape. And what popped into Nanera's head was his father's face. I won't be king, he said quietly. Nobody's going to force you to. Kakashi's voice grew even kinder. But you might change your mind after you get to the capital and talk with your sister. Kakashi put his hands on Nanera's shoulders and whirled him around. He could see the house where he was staying ahead on the road he'd come down. You should probably get back to bed already. Tomorrow we'll be sleeping outside. Nanera nodded and started walking, but then stopped and looked back. You'll come with me all the way to the capital, right, Kakashi? Of course. I am your tutor, after all. Kakashi waited until Nanera was out of sight before again opening the book he'd been reading. The Legend of the Six Hokage. He supposed that someone at some point, and no doubt mostly for their own amusement, had collected into a book all the stories and rumors that got passed among merchants. This volume had then made it all the way to the land of Ridaku and unexpectedly taken root. If they were going to turn someone into a myth, I wish they'd picked a hero who's a little more heroic, he thought. His own personal recommendation was the fourth. He admitted that it was hard to pass over the seventh, but Naruto's story wasn't complete yet, so there was no point in starting to tell it now. Never thought I'd see the day when I could read a book based on my own self, he muttered, stroking the dark paper of the cover. Nanera wouldn't stop going on about his precious sixth, so Kakashi had grown curious despite himself and picked up the book to see what all the fuss was about. Having read it now, he had to laugh at this ridiculously glorified fictional version of himself. In the book, the sixth Hokage was always a hero. Equipped with both strength and kindness, he was level-headed and never upset, always working to pull people forward. There wasn't a word about him being awkward or pathetic. Nothing of his inability to save his cherished friend or the fact that his only reason to continue fighting was to try and make that up to this friend. He merely sighed at the enormous gap between fiction and reality, but he supposed legends were like that. Only the stories that shine, episodes that linger in the mind, are selected, transformed, and passed on, becoming increasingly detached from the truth. It had been the same with his father, a man with such power that the three great shinobi paled in comparison. The white fan of Konoha, half revered as a living legend by other lands. But the real man had been the sort of person found in any village anywhere. He had his stern side and his troubles, and the words of other people could hurt him just like anyone else. Kakashi wasn't even 10 years old when he served as chief mourner at his father's wake. It had been a sweltering summer night. The air had been so hot and humid, he had trouble breathing. He remembered very well feeling almost like he'd been locked up underground. Kakashi had been the first person to discover the body of Itachi Sakumo after he passed and left his son behind, and it had also been Kakashi who reported this death to the Hokage at the time. Having had a long career as a jonin, Sakumo was fairly well known, and many people attended his wake. But not one of them truly mourned him. At least, it appeared so to Kakashi. He was so strong, and yet gone so soon. First, he breaks the code, then suicide? How irresponsible. His dad's dead, and the kid's cool as can be. It's a bit creepy. Of course he died, a guy like that. The whispered voices reached Kakashi's ears whether he liked it or not. He sat formally on his knees at the far end of the room, patiently waiting for the line of visitors to sprinkle incense at the altar and go. It's like I killed you, ain't it? A man spat at the memorial picture of his father. The friend Sakumo had disobeyed the rules to save. I never asked you to, you know. So not only do you up and quit the mission, you kill yourself? What a sorry excuse of a man. Kakashi held his tongue. Many people came to speak their own selfish words to the dead. Kakashi felt like he would lose his mind if he tried to consider which of them was right and what was true. The clear thing was that his father had died because he disobeyed the rules. If he had followed the rules and left his comrades to die, he would have still been alive. There were far fewer people at the funeral the next day. Apparently, most everyone had been satisfied with briefly gossiping before his father's photo at the wake. The short ceremony ended, and Kakashi walked home alone. Perhaps a little drunk on all the sutra chanting, the world wobbled before him, and he felt ill. Both his mind and his body were clumsy, not quite working properly. Darkness fell in his field of view, and the noisy chorus of the cicadas faded away. But even the simple act of stopping was too much of an annoyance to him. Nothing mattered anymore. His feet tangled beneath him and he pitched forward. Into someone's back. You were really strong back there, a voice told him, and he suddenly saw bright golden hair. He felt his breathing become a little easier. The yellow flash of Konoha. Namake's Minato. You can just stay like that on my back, Minato said, but Kakashi immediately pulled away to stand on his own 2 feet. Minato was famous in the village, well known as a shrewd ninja and thought to be next in line for Hokage. Kakashi had spoken with him a number of times, but they weren't particularly close. Excuse me. I haven't been sleeping, and I tripped over my feet, he said, politely formal, and started to bow and be on his way, but Minato grabbed his arm. Kakashi, Sakumo was dash. My father broke the rules and died, Kakashi forcefully interrupted Minato and then continued dispassionately. Obeying the rules and our codes is only natural for a ninja. My father didn't have the conviction to follow through. Even though emotions do nothing but get in the way. It was only natural that Kakashi was in pain given that his father had just died, but even the awareness of this ordinary emotion had scared him back then. With no one to blame for these feelings, Kakashi had become stubbornly fixated on obeying the rules. A few years later, Minato became Kakashi's boss and teamed up with him, Rin, and Obito in a 4-man cell. It was then that Kakashi learned that the rules were not everything, and that sometimes there were things he should put ahead of the rules. Thanks to Minato, Kakashi grew to accept the father he hadn't been able to acknowledge. Minato and Obito had affirmed the father that he rejected. And he felt like he'd only been able to lift the lid on his feelings for his father and face them for the first time after these two comrades acknowledged the dead man. And then they had died too, and Kakashi was racked with grief with each of their deaths. But it was also their presence in his life that had hauled him back up onto his feet again. Now he felt proud from the bottom of his heart to have been born the child of the White Fang of Konoha. Nanera and Kakashi continued to plod along on their horses. It was the morning of the 3rd day of the journey since they departed Nagar. Just half a day away from the capital, 2 messengers from the palace were waiting for them on the road. The Prime Minister sent us. It would be terrible if you were to lose your way, they explained. This was strange. Now that they'd come this far, the path led straight to the capital. But the messengers walked ahead to deliberately lead them on the clear road and took a detour to enter the capital not on the east side, which was closest to the village of Nagar, but on the north side. The main road from the northern gate to the palace was the center of the capital, with large houses crammed along either side. Booths were set up along the way, selling the country's specialties of salt, sake, and silk, and business was booming. The people coming and going all worked for noble families or the palace and were well dressed, no dirt on their faces like the people of Nagar. When they saw Nanera, they stepped aside and made a path for him. The capital's still as busy as ever, Nanera said, looking around from on top of his horse. He had meant his words for Kakashi next to him, but Kakashi didn't reply. Maybe he didn't hear him. They tied their horses to a hitching post and entered the palace. They had no sooner stepped into the corridor inside than the queen was coming out to welcome them personally. "I'm glad to see you, Nanera." Manari. In stark contrast to Nanera's hesitant step backward, Manari raced toward him happily and peered at his face. "Have you been well? What's life like in Nagar?" Her voice was the same as it always was, and the tension finally left his shoulders. What a relief. His sister was smiling. "I have a ton of fun every day," he told her. "You look good too." "I'm so glad. Now listen. I wanted to give you this." Manari took something from her sleeve and pressed it into Nanera's hand. "It's yours. A memento of father. Because you didn't choose a keepsake." A blue gem cut into a hexagon hung from the end of a silver chain. "Don't tell the Prime Minister, okay?" she said. "It's valuable, so I'm not supposed to give it away without following procedures and getting permission." "Thanks, Manari." Nanera hung the chain around his neck and hid the gem beneath his shirt. "Don't lose it." "I won't. I promise." "Prince Nanera, you must be more polite when speaking to the Queen." Manari's face clouded over the instant they heard this low voice echo in the corridor. The Prime Minister marched toward them, the hem of his long robe dragging showily behind him. Gray beard, husky voice. He always spoke in an overly polite manner to Nanera, to the point where it seemed almost malicious. The Prime Minister glanced at Kakashi. "And who is this?" "My new tutor," Nanera told him. "The last one quit." Although it was supposedly the Prime Minister who had dispatched Kakashi, this was at best in name only. In actuality, lower-ranking officials just picked tutors as they saw fit. So Kakashi was meeting the Prime Minister for the first time that day, and he asked Nanera in advance to please introduce him. "Is that so?" Well. The Prime Minister stared hard at Kakashi and then shifted his gaze to Nanera. "It is the custom on the first anniversary of a death for the royal family and the senior government officials to have a noon meal together. I have no doubt you are quite exhausted, so please, Take some time to rest in your room before we meet. A maid will come for you once the preparations are complete. Oh. Okay. Nanera glanced back at Kakashi. If possible, he wanted him at the dinner. Meeting his eyes, Kakashi guessed Nanera's feelings and shook his head. I'm sure an outsider like myself would only be in the way at a dinner like that. I'll stay in my room. You will. Nanera's face fell. Prime Minister, prepare a room for Kakashi. For this man? The Prime Minister was clearly vexed as he looked Kakashi up and down. Those who are not of the royal family or government officials are not permitted to stay in the palace. I will arrange lodgings for him elsewhere. No, Nanera said curtly. If Kakashi's not here, I won't stay in the palace either. Kakashi shrugged exaggeratedly. Could you make it a room with a big window? I don't do well in the damp. The Prime Minister sighed. Take him, he reluctantly ordered a maid waiting by the wall. They're late. Nanera waited impatiently in his own room for dinner to be ready. Even though it was clearly past noon, the Prime Minister still hadn't sent anyone for him. Prince Nanera, your dinner is ready, said the maid who finally came for him, and he frowned at her odd wording. It all fell into place for him, however, when he entered the dining hall. The adults had finished eating and were pouring each other glasses of post-dinner apricot liqueur. They had taken care of all the inconvenient discussions before the child arrived. That took forever. Nanera gave full voice to his displeasure as he pulled out a chair. He sat up as straight as he could so that he could rest his elbows on the round table, which was too tall for a child, and looked around at the adults. The Prime Minister next to the Queen haughtily ferried rich goat cheese into his mouth. Senior officials A, B, and C pretended to listen carefully to the Prime Minister's pointless chatter, finding smiles on their faces. And Queen Mayari focused her gaze on the wood grain of the oak table, as though she was trying desperately not to meet anyone else's eyes. I did in fact have another reason for calling you to the palace, Prince Nanera, the Prime Minister began without waiting for Nanera's dinner to be set before him. We will be dispatching the army to Nagar. Over the next few weeks, some 50 soldiers will stay there for approximately 10 days. I would ask that you make the preparations to provide rations for them during that period. Huh? Nanera blinked a couple times, unable to understand what the minister was talking about. We're starting a war, Mayari added ever so timidly. The capital has a serious water shortage. So we're invading a rich country to get a new source of water. Nanera looked back and forth between his sister and the Prime Minister, baffled. Soldiers? Invade? What on earth were they talking about? Mayari, he said. Explain this to me. It is perhaps somewhat difficult for you to understand, Prince Nanera, the Prime Minister said. Then explain it until I do, he commanded in a hard voice. Is that your wish? The Prime Minister leaned back against his chair, annoyed. Where to begin then? Our land has a relatively harsh environment compared with other countries. Summers are hot, winters are cold, and the majority of the land is poor with an overwhelming lack of natural resources. If there is a famine, no one will come to help us. We've just barely managed to eke out a life sowing wheat, but we will never see any real development. And thus, it has been decided that we shall move to a richer place. We will go to war, steal new land, and live there. New land? Nanera asked. Where exactly are you planning for us to live? The land of fire, the Prime Minister replied immediately. Huh? Nanera lifted his face in surprise. The land of fire? The Prime Minister nodded. A few years ago, at the discretion of the previous king, I descended the mountain. I traveled east from the land of Ridaku over several months and toured the outside countries. After I passed through the mountains and crossed several countries, I found the land of fire did indeed exist. The ruler there is not called a king, but rather a daimyo. The senior officials apparently hadn't heard the land of fire part, and they all looked at each other with confusion. This was the first time in the history of the land of Ridaku that the existence of the land of fire had been officially confirmed. So then, Nanera started. Was the sixth Hokage there? Yes, he does in fact exist. Unfortunately, he was out of the country for a conference, so I was not granted an audience with him. What surprised me was the development of the land of fire. The country was richer than we could even imagine. Plenty of food, excellent medical and welfare systems. Using highly developed technologies, they make lumps of metal dozens of kilometers long move at incredible speeds. The people get in these lumps and are transported around the country. And everyone has devices small enough to fit into the palm of a hand, which they use to share information dispatched from far-off places. No. One dies of starvation there. In fact, many people die from the intake of too much sugar. I don't really understand, Nanera said nervously, putting a damper on the Prime Minister's excitement. You're saying that you're planning to go to war because you want us to be like the Land of Fire? That is exactly correct. The Land of Fire has not experienced war in over a decade. We could say in fact that now, when they are drunk on peace, is precisely the time for an attack. The Prime Minister smiled, liver-spotted cheeks twisting upward. Prince Nanera, you do know that in the Land of Fire and the neighboring countries, there are fighting groups called shinobi, yes? Nanera nodded. The shinobi were amazing people who needed chakra to generate fire and water from nothing. The unparalleled sixth Hokage was also a shinobi. While I traveled to those neighboring countries and studied the manufacturing processes for heavy firearms, I forged connections with some powerful shinobi. Shinobi who left their organizations and now act independently, the so-called rogue shinobi. For our war, I have hired 50 of these rogue shinobi. 50 shinobi. To Nanera, shinobi were like gods. He thought of them as different creatures, like mountain rabbits or snow leopards. He couldn't immediately digest the idea of hiring 50 such creatures. But, one of the officials said hesitantly, it won't be that easy to get to the Land of Fire from here. The ninja will move us in 20 days, a distance that would take half a year by horse cart, the Prime Minister responded with a smirk. The mood in the room clearly began to change. 50 of these shinobi would be their allies. Thinking about it like this, the senior officials started to feel like they had a chance at victory. That was how special the shinobi were to the residents of the land of Ridaku and its total lack of offensive power. It was no wonder that their faces began to shine with expectation. The water shortage this year is a trial given to us by God, the Prime Minister said. When we overcome it and secure new land, our country will develop. Just as the Land of Fire did. Nanera turned his eyes to the untouched meal that sat before him. Yak cheese the color of the sun. Flat noodles made with flour and beans, turnip and wild vegetable miso soup. Salted goat meat, butter tea. And plenty of apricots. He ate things very similar in the village of Nagar, although there were fewer dishes there. All of it was food that could be gotten in this country. If they started trading with other countries like Kakashi said, would they get many more kinds of food on their tables? Having never left the country, Nanera couldn't imagine what other kinds of foods there were in the world. But what was wrong with the way things were now? To Nanera, what lay before his eyes was indeed a feast. He had never even thought about wanting to eat other things. What had the Prime Minister seen outside the country? Was the food out there really that good? Was it worth taking, even if it meant war? Nanera looked at his sister. You agree with this, Mayonari? Yes. She nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on her empty plate, as though some kind of answer was written there. We have already received the consent of Her Majesty, the Prime Minister said. He stood up, came around to Nanera, and leaned forward. In a mere decade or two, the Land of Fire accomplished astonishing technological development. This is courtesy of the might of the sixth Hokage. However, during the era of war and unrest, I hear that even he spent all his time fighting as a shinobi. Prince Nanera, If you truly do aspire to be like the 6th Hokage, then would you not give the people of our country the same experience as that very 6th Hokage? Yellowed eyes bored through him, and Nanera nodded vaguely, before popping one of the apricots on his plate into his mouth as if trying to get out of this conversation. The room the Prime Minister had selected for Kakashi was plenty humid, as if to spite him. There was only one small window to let in light, so even though it was high noon, it was quite gloomy. Master Kakashi. I brought tea. Thanks. Could you just put it there? He asked. The maid stepped toward the wooden chest he indicated with his eyes. Thunk. He struck her very lightly with a hand strike to the back of the neck. She lost consciousness, staggering forward, and Kakashi caught her with one arm. She would have felt no pain at all. She had simply fallen asleep. The sleep chakra point, a technique he had learned directly from Iruka, the principal of the Ninja Academy. When Kakashi mentioned in conversation that he had trouble sleeping sometimes, Iruka had taught him a secret jutsu for inducing restful sleep. The sticking point, though, was that it was hard to hit the spot on yourself, given that the chakra point was on the back of the neck. Kakashi laid the softly snoring maid on the bed and wove a sign. The art of transformation. Bump. Smoke rose up, and Kakashi was now a perfect copy of the sleeping maid. His plan was to change his appearance so that he wouldn't catch anyone's eye and could move openly around the palace. Transformed into the maid, he tucked the wooden tray under his arm and left the room. With a very ladylike gait, he walked quietly down the long hallway. He wanted to investigate two things. One was the shuigu handed down in the royal family. The other was the period when the Sage of Six Paths had stayed in this region. He had come to this country to begin with to look into the Sage of Six Paths for Naruto. Information gathered where people gathered. The laundry room, the kitchen, or... Oh! Hey! You! New girl, someone called out, and Kakashi stopped. Was he the new girl? Two maids beckoned him from inside of a nearby room. One had a broom, the other a dustpan. They appeared to be in the middle of cleaning. Kakashi stepped inside, and they leaned in close. You brought Prince Nanera's tutor tea, right? One asked. What's he like? Said the other. Why were they curious about a mere guest like Kakashi? They couldn't have found out he was a ninja from Konoha, could they? Kakashi reflexively braced himself, hyper-aware of the position of the knife beneath his skirt. The maids continued, eyes glittering. Where did they find such a sullen tutor? Right? I'm really into that kind of downerish old guy. Kakashi said idiotically. The maids kept chatting, getting more and more worked up, without realizing that the man in question was standing before them. Hiding his face, though. That's a mean trick. I wonder if he's married? He didn't really understand what was going on, but that was fine as long as they didn't suspect him. He casually let his gaze roam over the two women. One of them was the boss, judging by her outfit. One pocket of her long dress bulged out in the shape of a key ring. He hesitantly interjected, playing the new girl. It seems like there are a lot of rooms. Are there many visitors coming to the palace? Been a lot lately. Look, see there? The maid went over to the window and pointed outside. A number of white yurts were set up on the plain that stretched out to the east of the capital. The Prime Minister just hired a bunch of army people, and that's their camp. Even though there's a water shortage and we can't grow anything here, we have to provide rations for all of them. It's terrible. And I guess he's paying them very handsomely, the other woman noted. The Prime Minister says those people are going to solve the water shortage. Ninja. Everything fell into place for Kakashi when he saw the movements of the people coming and going among the tents. From the size of the camp and the number of tents, there were maybe 50 of them. The Prime Minister had hired ninja to go to war with the Land of Fire. Water. Too much, too little, trouble either way, one of the maids complained. 6 months ago, there There was this huge flash flood and all the fields around here got washed away. I guess the flow of snowmelt changed because of a landslide up near the top of the mountain. Or at least that's what the Prime Minister said. The flood had most likely happened because Mayuri couldn't control the Shoigu. But it seemed like the maids didn't even know such a tool existed. Things are getting bad. The other maid clucked her tongue. Only a matter of time before the food stores are empty. But we work at the palace, so we'll manage somehow. Everything's been upside down since Queen Mayuri took the throne. I miss the old king. Finding his chance to jump into the conversation, Kakashi changed the subject. I never actually saw the old king. I only moved to the capital recently. There's a portrait of him in his office. But we're not allowed to go in there. We're not? Kakashi said. I'll have to be careful not to go in by mistake. Where was it again? 3rd floor, end of the hall. The new maid smiled and thanked her kind colleagues before leaving the room. Kakashi walked calmly down the hallway, turned the corner, and went left at the landing on the stairs before pulling out the bundle of keys caught on the tip of his kunai. He had quietly pinched them from the pocket of the boss maid. After checking there was no one around, he unlocked the double doors and slipped inside. The room was silent. All 4 walls were covered in bookshelves that reached the ceiling. This was the former king's office. The books were shelved seemingly at random, and their spines formed a kind of mosaic. Among stacks of volumes on the history of the land of Ridaku, anatomy, pictorial guides to plants, and the collected legends of the 6th Hokage, Kakashi found one without a title on its spine and reached out his hand. It was at the very edge of the very top shelf, a position that his middle finger just barely reached with the maid's height. The discolored straw paper was held shut with silkworm thread. A skilled hand had written manuscript, 6 Paths Journal on the dyed-wood cover. Found it. The record of the Sage of 6 Paths sojourn in this nation. Unfortunately, however, only the cover was written in modern language. The text inside was not in the common language, and he couldn't read a word of it. Still, the book was an important find. He tucked the manuscript away in his top and continued peering at the shelves. From what he gleaned from the maid's conversation, the people in the palace were not aware of the existence of the Shoigu. There was a good possibility that the former king hid that in his own office. If my guess is right, if I can find it, the capital's water shortage will be over. He looked up and noticed a familiar spine. He'd seen the same red leather book on a lower shelf. Why would there be 2 copies of the same book? He picked it up and found that it was in fact a book-shaped case. Inside was a letter. What are you doing, Prime Minister? Kakashi returned the book to the shelf and tweaked the phase of his transformation jutsu before turning around. If he were seen in the study wearing the maid's face, that girl would get in trouble. Excuse me. It's gotten quite dusty in here. I was going to clean up a bit. The previous king's office is an administrative area. No one is allowed to enter without permission, the Prime Minister said sharply and walked over to Kakashi, the heels of his wooden shoes clacking against the floor. What of the tutor that Prince Nanera clings to? He's resting in his room. He is? Anything suspicious about him? No. I didn't notice anything in particular. I see. He took another step and stopped immediately in front of Kakashi. Sir? Oh. The tutor I hired for Prince Nanera was a young woman, you see. The Prime Minister's tone was oddly familiar, considering that he was speaking with a strange maid. And then, at some point, that man became his tutor. Who hired him, I wonder? I have no idea, sir. Perhaps the adults of the village simply assigned a suitable person, the maid answered, and the Prime Minister yanked on her arm. Eek! The force of the Prime Minister's hand was too much for her slender frame, and she quickly lost her balance. Kakashi thrust a hand out against the wall to act as though he were just barely staying on his feet. The Prime Minister peered at his face. Apparently, those shinobi can transform themselves into the spitting image of another person. You be careful not to get replaced without your knowing it. Yes, sir. I heard that Master Kakashi is just a regular tutor, though. Kakashi swung the bob that reached his shoulders and cocked his head to one side, playing innocent. One more thing. The corners of the Prime Minister's mouth curled up. A few weeks ago, someone somewhere filled the cistern with fresh water. Thanks to that kind soul, we haven't had a single famine death since. You wouldn't happen to have any thoughts on who could have done such a thing and how? Oh my! The maid opened her eyes wide in surprise. Are people dying of famine outside of the palace? The Prime Minister stared very carefully at her face and her gestures, clucked his tongue, and turned on his heel. Ah, yikes. Bad. That Prime Minister is as distrustful as he looks. Once Kakashi was back in his room and had released the transformation, he tapped on the shoulder of the real maid, asleep on his bed with her mouth open. Her eyelids fluttered and then lifted, and in the next instant, she leaped up with a gasp. Ah, I am so sorry. I can't believe me. Falling asleep in a guest's room. You must be tired. Well, it's no wonder. Here. Thanks so much for the tea. He downed the now ice-cold tea in a single gulp and held out the empty teacup. The maid walked toward the door, fixing her hair as she did so, and Kakashi called out to her as though he had just remembered something. Oh, actually, could you take a look at this book? It was the manuscript on the Sage of Six Paths that he nicked from the king's office. I borrowed this from the Prime Minister, but I can't read it. The characters are pretty different from what we use in the land of Ridaku these days. Oh, that's an ancient script, the maid replied, peering at the page. This is the language they spoke in this area ages ago. No one uses it now. I heard there's no way to decode it anymore. So I guess there's no one who can read it. I don't suppose there is, she agreed. There's talk of getting rid of those old books since it's pointless to save them when no one can read them. Either way, he better send the book to the Land of Fire as soon as possible. Kakashi waited for the maid to leave and then turned to the window and gave a signal. The hawk waiting on standby came gliding down. He tossed the manuscript, and the bird caught it deftly in its sharp claws. It wheeled around, spread its wings, and flew off into the eastern sky, almost gliding to the 7th Hokage of Kanagakure. At best, it would arrive in 2 days. He'd written a note about how he found it and the situation here and slipped it inside the book. It was too bad that the manuscript was written in an ancient language, but he was sure that Sakura or Shikamaru would be able to decipher it. He was watching the hawk grow smaller in the sky when Nanera knocked on his door. The boy looked glum and was holding a book to his chest. How was the dinner? Kakashi asked. Nanera didn't reply, but instead thrust the book out at him, lips still tightly pursed. Read this. He was about to tell Nanera to read it himself. Why else had Kakashi put all that time into teaching him the characters? But then he stopped. All right, he said. He eased himself into a chair and opened the book, and Nanera dropped down to sit on the rug. Of course, the book Nanera had brought was The Legend of the Sixth Hokage. This one had a different cover than the volume in Nagar. Kakashi didn't turn the page. Instead, he kept his eyes on Nanera. Are your sister and the Prime Minister maybe wanting to go to war? Nanera looked stunned. How did you know? The maids were gossiping about it. Nanera picked at the rug and stared at the characters that read The Legend of the Sixth Hokage on the cover of the book. The Prime Minister said we're going to war with the Land of Fire. What do you think? Kakashi? Even if you do, you can't win. But Kakashi couldn't say that yet, and so he asked a question instead. What do you think about it? Nanera thought for a minute. I think what the Prime Minister really wants to do is trade. He wants to have relationships with other countries and get rich. But there aren't any countries around us, so he wants to go to war and take some land, he said slowly, while also looking up at Kakashi questioningly. You said before the Land of Fire started trading lots once they were at peace, right? But this country's always been at peace. So why does he want to take from another country now? Maybe because this isn't peace. Huh? Kakashi stood up and looked out the window. The sun was just starting to set. How about we go outside for a minute? The land of Ridaku was over 4,000 meters above sea level, and the temperature plummeted when night drew near. Kakashi came on the south side of the palace with Nanara in tow, the opposite side from the northern district with all the noble houses. This was where the common people lived. There's kind of a strange smell, Nanara said. Is something rotting? Something is probably rotting, Kakashi agreed. Nanara opened his mouth to ask what and then froze. Bodies were piled up one on top of the other on woven mats spread out on the street. Sooty hair spread out beneath the stomachs of people lying face down. They had been left there for quite some time already. The bodies were turning black in places and emitting a terrible stench. Huh. Something pushed up from inside his stomach. He reflexively crouched down, but since he had barely eaten at the dinner, all that came up were gastric juice and some undigested butter. Why? Why are these people here dead? Kakashi, let's go. Deathly pale, he tugged on his tutor's sleeve, but Kakashi gave Nanara a push, forcing him to step forward. This is your country, he told him. No. Nanara replied lifelessly and wiped the comers of his mouth. He was part of the royal family, but he wasn't king. This was his sister's country. Kakashi, did you know this was happening in the city? I heard about it from the maids, he replied. They said with the water shortage and the crop failure, people were dying. I didn't know about any of this. Wait. Water shortage? Isn't Manari using the tool? They kept walking and came out onto a plaza. Nanara was on edge, wondering what miserable scene they would encounter, so he was a tiny bit relieved when he saw the people gathered in the plaza. They had set scraps of wood on fire here and there and were huddled together around them, taking warmth from the flames. As they chatted, one person or another would smile every so often. But they were, without exception, emaciated, with limbs that were nothing more than bones with skin stretched over them. Now he understood why Kakashi had told him to change into the clothes he'd worn from Negar before they left the palace. If he had come out here still dressed for the dinner, the embroidered orange gown and jeweled hat would have been torn from his body. Stay right here. I'll be back before you can count to 100. Kakashi's words basically went into one ear and out the other. A pigeon had landed in the square, and the look in everyone's eyes changed immediately. One man tried to sneak up on it. But the bird took a few steps, head bobbing and weaving, and then it flapped its wings and set off into the sky. The plaza was blanketed in dejection. Everyone was hungry. What's that scared look for? You want some? A thin man noticed Nanara and pulled a wooden skewer from the fire, offering it to him. A lizard hung on it, twisted up in an S, its back sliced open. Nanara paled and shook his head. It was repulsive. How could that be food? He took a step away, and his back hit a wall on the edge of the plaza. The strength drained out of his legs at last, and he slumped down on the spot. He couldn't believe the capital had come to this. There was no way his sister and the Prime Minister didn't know what was happening. They had decided on war precisely because they didn't know about it. Everyone was thirsty and hungry. This country needed water and food. If they fought, would they be able to get what everyone wanted? Nanara looked around the plaza again. He saw a little girl peel off some bark and suck on it. Her chest and stomach were so sunken he almost wondered if something was wrong with his eyes. She was only about half as wide as a child of the same height in Negar. Nanera reached into his shirt and grabbed the gem against his chest, the precious keepsake of his father that his sister had given him earlier. He was sure he wasn't the one who needed this gem. He approached the girl and put the jewel in her hand. She looked up at him with wide eyes. There's still plenty of water in the North District. If you trade this for money, they'll sell you some. That was all he said before he raced away from the spot. A small gesture like that wouldn't really make things better, but it had to have been better than doing nothing. Would his father have praised him if he'd seen it? He ran along without really looking where he was going and slammed into someone. Kakashi. Let's go home. Nanera tugged on Kakashi's sleeve. I get it. On the way back to the palace, they could see faint wisps of smoke rising up to the east of the capital. The shinobi the Prime Minister hired are camped over there, Kakashi said, his eyes lingering on the base of the smoke. The maids were saying that rations are distributed to them first. Nanera lifted his gaze. It was dusk only moments ago, but the sky was dark in the blink of an eye, and now the gray of the smoke melted into the mostly navy sky. He hired 50 shinobi, he whispered, dropping his eyes to the ground. You think maybe even the great 6th Hokage fall up against that many shinobi? Instant death, I expect, Kakashi replied. For whom? The 50 nobodies, of course. A random group of average shinobi doesn't begin to compare with the Hokage. Plus, there are plenty of strong shinobi in the Land of Fire besides the Hokage. When the man standing guard at the palace gate saw Nanera and Kakashi outside, the look on his face revealed he would be in trouble. They'd slipped out of the palace without anyone knowing, and this guard had probably been told not to let them outside. They ignored him and went inside. The land of Ridaku can't win against the Land of Fire. But even setting that aside, what the country should be doing now isn't war, Kakashi said coolly. A country develops faster and better by building friendly relationships instead of fighting other countries. The history of the Land of Fire is proof of that. The problems would be solved if there was water, so why dash? Nanera started to say and then snapped his mouth shut because a maid was walking toward them. Master Kakashi, perfect timing. It was the maid who had shown him to his room that afternoon. I have a message from the Prime Minister. He wishes for you to attend to Prince Nanera and come with him to breakfast tomorrow. Kakashi pulled on his jacket as he entered the dining hall the following morning, where everyone else was already seated. Oh, I'm late. At the table were Nanera, the Prime Minister, and the Queen. An unlikely group for lively conversation. He sat down in an empty chair, and a maid silently laid breakfast out for him. I heard that you will be leaving this afternoon. If only you could have a more leisurely stay. The Prime Minister's comments hung in the air. But chit-chatting about travel plans was not the reason he made sure that Kakashi was seated at the same table as the Queen. Not when the Prime Minister had been so reluctant to even let Kakashi stay within the walls of the palace. Kakashi scooped up some jam with a wooden spoon. How far did the Prime Minister have his hooks and Mayari? Were they thick as thieves, or was she simply being forced to go along with him? He wanted to dig into this, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. Or anyone else's for that matter. That reminds me, the Prime Minister said. It seems that you went for a walk in the Southern District with Prince Nanera last night. Here we go. The main event. The jam was sweeter than he expected, and Kakashi frowned at the taste as he nodded. I did. You must have been surprised at the current drought we're experiencing. It's been causing us no end of worry. Seems best to deal with it quickly, don't you think? Kakashi said. If it keeps up, a lot more people will suffer, I expect. The truth is, 3 weeks ago, someone replenished the reserve cistern in a single night. Thanks to that act, we haven't had a single death recently. The Prime Minister's gaze was probing as he continued. As of yesterday, the cistern had dropped by 2/3. But this morning, it was full again. I wonder who performed such magic for us. You wouldn't happen to know? No. Kakashi thought for a minute and shook his head. It's the first I've heard of anyone dying from starvation. But perhaps it would be best to try and fix that? Just because the cistern went and filled itself twice doesn't mean there'll be a third time. Yes, the Prime Minister agreed. That is why we go to war. Have you already had a look at the group of shinobi I've hired? Sister, Nanera suddenly called out to Mayuri. It was only her little brother, and yet Mayuri stiffened. What? She lifted her face awkwardly. Why don't you use the shoigu? The expressions on the faces of Mayuri and the Prime Minister changed instantly. The maids noticed the way the air in the room had frozen, and they looked at each other dubiously. In this charged atmosphere, Kakashi alone retained his cool, as though no one had said anything of any importance. He ignored the others and spooned rice porridge into his mouth. If you use the shoigu like Father did, you can fix the water shortage, Nanera insisted. Why don't you do that? You will be quiet, the Prime Minister said in a low voice, glaring at Nanera. The existence of the shoigu is confidential. We may be inside the palace, but this is not a topic for light conversation. Can you use it? Nanera asked. The color drained from Minori's face. The Prime Minister clucked his tongue before slamming his goblet down on the table. You left the palace. That is none of your concern. Queen Minori is genuinely troubled by the matter of the shoigu. It is not your place to speak of it. Troubled? Nanera said. You mean she can't use it? She can't use the shoigu, so there's not enough water. That's why you're going to go to war and take it from other countries? The Prime Minister slowly exhaled and glared at Kakashi, a blue vein popping up on his forehead. Was it you who whispered these things in Prince Nanera's ears? HM? I don't know what you mean. Kakashi cocked his head to one side, confused. I don't even know what the shoigu you're talking about is. Perhaps because of everything that had transpired over breakfast, when Kakashi and Nanera left the palace later that day, neither the Prime Minister nor the Queen came to see them off. They walked through the residential area on the south side, leading their horses rather than taking the main road of the north. There had been a fair number of people around when they visited in the evening, but the area was deserted during the day. They caught glimpses of a few children, and that was it. The adults had likely gone to fetch water from somewhere. Nanera averted his eyes from the corpses on the road and kept his head down the whole time. The bodies were all emaciated, and exacerbated by the dry climate, many dried out and became mummies before they rotted. Even so, maggots crawled around mouths and nostrils, and the buzzing of flies followed them like the sound of rain at a distance. The surviving residents were no doubt at a loss for how to deal with the bodies. In the land of Ridaku, burial was the mainstream, but a significant amount of work was required to go and bury a person outside of the capital. When people die, they get heavier. Kakashi knew in his bones the weight of the recovered bodies of comrades, the weight of colleagues who died while still on his back being carried to safety, the weight of the single eye given in the final moments of a close friend who he didn't even get the chance to carry on his back. He didn't want to do any of that ever again. That was exactly why Kakashi had pushed the development of Kanagakure as the 6th Hokage. Many people had criticized him, saying he was disrespecting the old traditions. But he never wanted to repeat the days of war again. A never-ending peace. That was what Kakashi had sought as the 6th Hokage. An orderly society that would go on and on even when he was not the Hokage, even when the day came when the role of Hokage disappeared. To create a framework so that they would never again fall into the quagmire of war. This was the sole tribute the survivor Kakashi could offer to his dead friend. Because that friend had told him to become Hokage. He had been desperate to get as close as he could to realizing the world without absurdity that his friend had thirsted for. For a long time, Obito was the reason why Kakashi continued to fight. And now he was the needle on the compass Kakashi used to guide him on his path forward. His reunion with Obito, Rin, and his master was no doubt still far in the future, but he very much wanted to live in a manner that he could be proud of when they did finally meet. Which was exactly why he couldn't turn his eyes away from what was happening right before him, this whole situation in the land of Ridaku. And Naruto and his difficult predicament in the land of fire. "Sir," someone called out, and when he lowered his gaze, he saw a skinny girl standing there. It was the girl Kakashi had met on his first day in the land of Ridaku. "You're the one who gave me water that time, right?" Kakashi said nothing and pushed back the hair plaster to the girl's face. On her right cheek was a reddish-black bruise, exactly the size of an adult fist. Her small nose was broken, twisted, and the blood that ran from her nostrils to below her chin was completely dried. Clearly marks from someone hitting her. The girl pushed the wooden bowl she held in both hands toward Kakashi. "Give me more water." Kakashi crouched down, held his left hand over the bowl, and poured water into it. As he did that, he touched the girl's cheek with his other hand and let chakra flow into it. He wasn't particularly versed in medical ninjutsu, but he could at least ease the pain. "What happened to your face?" Nanera's trembling voice came from behind Kakashi. "What happened to the jewel?" "Jewel?" Kakashi frowned. Nanera ran over and grabbed her shoulders. "Who did this to you?" Shocked, the girl shrank back. The wooden bowl fell from her hands and spilled onto the ground. For a second, she stared at it, but then ran off and left it. "That girl," Nanera murmured, watching her go. "Why didn't anything change?" "I gave her the jewel, but why?" "What? Gave her the jewel?" Nanera rambled on plaintively. "I gave it to her. A necklace with a big jewel on it, a keepsake of my father. It was blue and beautiful, and she should have been able to buy lots to eat at least if she traded it for money. So why is she still looking for water? Why? Doesn't she know how to trade for money? But then the adults in her life would help." He cut himself off abruptly, realizing what he had done. What would happen in a country with so many starving people if he gave just one of them a gem? Especially if that one of them was a small, powerless child. He let out a silent cry and began to shake. Kakashi placed a hand on his trembling shoulders, and Nanera squeezed Kakashi's bony fingers, clinging to them. End of Chapter 2. Thank you for listening. Remember to like and subscribe for lots more.